The tent smelled like scorched rubber and burnt coffee, and under the lights of the fairground, the old dragster sat gleaming and useless, its chrome headers throwing back the glare of 100 phone cameras, and Ava Sterling stood beside it with her arms crossed and a smile that did not quite reach her eyes. Because in the last 20 minutes, 4 men who called themselves professionals had tried and failed to make this machine speak. The crowd had grown thick around the roped-off square of asphalt, charity raffle tickets forgotten in pockets, and somewhere a child was crying because her balloon had popped, and none of it mattered because the only sound anyone wanted was the sound this car refused to make. Ava raised her voice over the murmur and said it again, the way she had said it, as a joke 20 minutes earlier, before the joke had curdled into something closer to a dare. Start this $500 dragster, and it is yours, free and clear, pink slip and all, right here in front of everybody. She had said it grinning, the CEO of Sterling Performance Motors turning a dead relic into a stunt for the cameras, never once expecting the car to actually start, because if it could have started, her own senior technicians would have done it in the first 90 seconds. A man near the rope had murmured that it was a scam, that the fuel line had to be cut somewhere nobody could see, and Ava had opened her mouth to defend her family's name, when a quiet voice from the back of the crowd asked if he could take a look. Every head turned. A woman near the front let out a short laugh, sharp and disbelieving at the sight of him. Not a suit, not a racing jacket, just a man in a faded flannel with grease permanently pressed into the creases of his knuckles, a small girl in pigtails gripping his other hand like she had grown there. Cole Bennett did not ask about parts or tools. He did not touch the carburetor that 4 experts had already stripped down twice. He walked to the driver's door, opened it without ceremony, and reached his arm behind the seat into the shadow where nobody had thought to look, and his hand closed around something small and metal, and he turned it with 2 fingers, and the whole tent went silent enough to hear the click. Then he straightened, nodded once to the girl beside him, as if to say, "Watch this," and turned the key. The dragster did not sputter. It roared, a full-throated, window-rattling bark of an engine that had been sleeping for longer than the girl standing next to it had been alive. And somewhere behind Ava a clipboard hit the pavement and nobody bent to pick it up, because everyone was staring at the quiet man who had just made a $500 joke into the most expensive mistake of the afternoon. To find out how a man nobody in that crowd had ever heard of walked past 4 professionals and put his hand on the one thing they'd all missed, and what it cost the woman standing next to him to admit it, stay until the very end. If you have ever watched a quiet person get overlooked by everyone certain they knew better, and felt something tighten in your chest because you have seen it happen to someone you love, you already know why stories like this one matter. And we would love to hear in the comments if you are one of the many people watching tonight who has lived some version of what you are about to see. Because here is the question this story keeps circling back to, gently, without ever quite landing. When a room full of credentialed experts fails, and one quiet man with grease-stained hands succeeds on his first try, is that luck? Or is it proof that some kinds of knowledge never show up on a resume at all? 3 years before that afternoon, under the fairground lights, none of what you just watched existed. Cole Bennett was not yet a stranger, walking through a rope line to shame 4 mechanics without saying a word. He was a maintenance technician at a mid-sized fabrication plant 2 towns over. A man who showed up at 5:40 in the morning and left after the last shift alarm sounded, who kept his head down and his voice lower, and who went home every night to a small yellow house with a garage door that never fully closed right, where his daughter Sophie waited for him with a peanut butter sandwich cut into triangles, because that was the only way she would eat it. Cole had not always been a man who fixed loading conveyors and replaced worn bearings for $18 an hour. 9 years before that, he had been a design engineer at Sterling Performance Motors itself, the very company whose CEO would one day offer him a joke of a car in front of a crowd of strangers. And he had been good at it, quietly, thoroughly good, the kind of engineer whose name appeared on patent filings and not on award stages. He had helped design the fuel delivery system for the very model of dragster that would sit half dead on that fairground pavement 3 years later, back when the car was the company's flagship, back before a catastrophic test track failure, during a televised demonstration burned through the company's reputation, and someone needed to be blamed quickly, publicly, and permanently. Cole had not caused that failure. He had, in fact, flagged the exact vulnerability that caused it, 11 months before it happened, in a memo that vanished from the file the week after the accident, a memo that a rising young project lead named Marcus Reyes had quietly buried because acknowledging it would have exposed his own decision to fast-track the design past Cole's objections to save 6 weeks on a launch date. Marcus was smooth in every meeting, sharp in every deflection, the kind of man who used words like optimization and stakeholder alignment to turn blame into weather, something that simply happened to everyone and belonged to no one. When the company needed a name attached to the failure, Marcus made sure it was Cole's, dressed up in language about oversight gaps and insufficient diligence, and the board, eager to close the story before the stock dropped further, did not look past the folder Marcus handed them. Cole could have fought it. He thought about fighting it, in the weeks after his termination, in the nights he sat at his kitchen table with his old design files spread out under a single bulb, while his wife Maria slept upstairs. Already sick by then, though neither of them yet had a name for what was wrong. But a legal fight against a company with Sterling's resources meant years, meant depositions, meant a level of public exposure that would follow Sophie to school one day, when she was old enough to type her father's name into a search bar. And Cole made the only decision that felt like it protected the two people who mattered, which was to go quiet, take the maintenance job across town, and let the story die instead of feeding it. He never said this to anyone, not even to Maria in the end, not even to himself in so many words. He simply built a life that asked nothing of anyone, and he kept every one of his old design notebooks in a locked drawer in the garage, underneath the workbench, where he restored engines with his daughter on weekends. Not because he was waiting for anything, but because some part of him could not throw away 20 years of work, just because someone else had decided it was worthless. Ava Sterling, meanwhile, inherited Sterling Performance Motors from her father 18 months after Cole's quiet exit. At a moment when the company was still bleeding reputation from the accident, nobody talked about directly anymore, and she inherited Marcus Reyes along with it, promoted by then to Vice President of Product Integrity, a title that made the board feel better about the mess he had helped create. Ava did not know Cole Bennett's name. She had been finishing her MBA on the other side of the country when the accident happened, and by the time she took over the company, the story had calcified into a clean, forgettable version. A technical oversight, a departed employee, a lesson learned and filed away. She trusted Marcus because her father had trusted him, because he spoke in the fluent, confident language of quarterly projections that made boardrooms feel safe, and because she had 100 fires to put out and no bandwidth to reopen one that appeared, on paper, to be settled. What she did not yet know, standing at a charity event 3 years later, next to a half-dead dragster that had once been the company's proudest achievement, was that the man who would walk out of that crowd and reach behind a driver's seat like he had done it 1,000 times before, was the same man whose name Marcus Reyes had spent 3 years making sure nobody would ever think to ask about again. 6 weeks would pass after that first charity event before Ava Sterling, unable to let the moment go, would show up unannounced at a small yellow house with a garage door that never closed right, carrying a question she did not yet know how to ask. To understand why that unannounced visit would matter so much, you have to go back further, to the 11 days that ended Cole Bennett's career at Sterling Performance Motors. 11 days that started with a memo he wrote on a Tuesday afternoon and ended with a termination meeting on the following Friday of the next week, a meeting that lasted 4 minutes and that Cole would remember, years later, in exact and unbearable detail. The memo itself was 3 pages long, technical and precise, flagging a stress tolerance issue in the fuel delivery housing of the new Dragster line, a component Cole had designed but that Marcus Reyes, under pressure from the board to hit a launch date tied to a $9 million sponsorship deal with a national racing circuit, had ordered modified to save manufacturing time. Cole's memo did not accuse anyone. It simply laid out the numbers, the tolerances, the specific failure mode that could occur under sustained high RPM conditions if the modified housing was used without an additional safety valve, a valve Cole had already designed and mocked up in his own time, a small manual override switch tucked behind the driver's seat, where it would not interfere with the car's silhouette during promotional photography, a detail that mattered enormously to the marketing department and not at all to safety, except that it did, catastrophically 6 weeks after Marcus buried that memo in a folder marked Resolve. See follow-up that contained no follow-up at all. The failure happened during a live demonstration run in front of 200 invited guests and a national television crew, the housing cracking under sustained load exactly as Cole had predicted, sending a spray of fuel across the engine bay that the driver, thank every mercy, managed to control before it became something worse than a fire and a ruined car and a company's worst day in decades. Nobody was badly hurt. The dragster was gutted, patched together enough to be hauled into storage, and eventually, years later, wheeled out as a half-joking charity stunt because nobody at Sterling Performance Motors wanted to spend real money restoring a car connected to their worst public failure. But in the 4 days after the accident, with cameras still circling and the board demanding someone accountable by end of week, Marcus Reyes sat across from Cole in a glass conference room and asked him, gently, almost kindly, whether he had adequately flagged the concerns about the housing modification before it went into production. Cole said that he had, in writing, and asked Marcus directly whether that memo still existed. Marcus said he would look into it. He did not look into it. By Friday, Cole's file contained a performance review, backdated and freshly signed, noting insufficient diligence in design verification, and Cole was let go with 2 weeks severance and a request, phrased as a suggestion, that he not discuss the internal review process publicly given the sensitivity of the ongoing situation. Cole did not raise his voice in that meeting. He did not produce his own copy of the memo, tucked safely in a drawer at home, because in that moment, stunned and humiliated in front of a man who had smiled at him through every step of his own quiet destruction, Cole was thinking mostly of Maria, 3 months pregnant with complications the doctors had only just started to worry about, and of the mortgage on the yellow house, and of how a prolonged fight over a buried memo against a company with unlimited lawyers could take years he did not have, and money he did not have, and energy that Maria needed him to spend on her. Instead, he signed the severance agreement. He walked out of the building he had helped build engines for, carrying a cardboard box with 9 years of desk photographs and a coffee mug, and he did not look back at the glass doors, because there was a version of himself that wanted to, and he did not trust that version to stay quiet if he did. The story Sterling Performance Motors told internally, and eventually to the 2 or 3 trade journalists who asked about the accident in the following months, was simple and clean. A design oversight corrected, an employee who had not been diligent enough quietly let go, systems improved. Nobody asked why the improved systems included, 6 months later, the exact manual safety valve Cole had designed and proposed, now installed in every subsequent model, credited in an internal engineering bulletin to a cross-functional safety review, with no single name attached to it. Marcus made sure of that too. It cost him nothing to let an anonymous committee take credit for a dead man's idea, when the man in question was still very much alive, but had made himself, by every practical measure, invisible. This is the part of the story that so many of you watching will recognize in your own lives, maybe not with dragsters and design patents, but with the quiet work you did that someone else's name ended up attached to. The promotion that went to the person who talked the loudest in meetings, instead of the person who actually solved the problem. And if that sounds familiar, we would be grateful if you shared even a small piece of it in the comments below, because so many of you carry a version of this story that nobody around you has ever properly heard. Cole took the maintenance job at the fabrication plant 4 months after his termination, a job that paid less than half what he had made as an engineer, but that asked nothing of him beyond precision and reliability, 2 things he still had in abundance even after everything else had been stripped away. He told himself it was temporary. It became permanent the way these things do, 1 mortgage payment and 1 doctor's appointment at a time, until Maria's pregnancy complications turned into something far more serious 18 months after Sophie was born, a diagnosis that arrived quietly and left just as quietly 4 years later, in a hospital room where Cole held his daughter's small hand in one of his and Maria's in the other, until only one hand was left to hold. He did not tell anyone at the fabrication plant about the engineer he used to be. He did not tell Sophie, not really. Not in words she was old enough to understand, though she knew her father could fix anything with an engine in it, and she had taken, from the age of 4, to sitting on an overturned bucket in the garage every Saturday morning, handing him wrenches by size before he even asked for them. The two of them rebuilding old engines together in a silence that Cole found more restful than any conversation he'd had in years. There is an old and stubborn debate that runs underneath stories like this one, and it is worth naming plainly. Some people believe a man like Cole should have fought harder, should have produced his memo, and forced the truth into the light the moment it was buried, whatever the cost, because silence only ever protects the people already in power. Others believe that a father facing a sick wife and a newborn daughter owes his loyalty first to the people depending on him, and that walking away from a fight he could not afford to lose was not weakness, but the clearest kind of courage there is. There is no single right answer here, and Cole himself never spent much time deciding which side he belonged to, because deciding wasn't a luxury he had. He simply did the next necessary thing every single day for 3 years, until an afternoon under a charity fairground tent put him back in front of the very machine that had once cost him everything. 11 months later, on an ordinary Tuesday that Cole would not remember as anything special until long after it mattered, Sterling Performance Motors would announce a charity event to raise money for a regional children's hospital, an event that would place that same battered dragster in the middle of a fairground for the first time in 3 years, and would put Ava Sterling in front of a crowd with a joke she never should have made. The joke had worked exactly as Ava intended, right up until it hadn't. Standing under the tent lights, with the dragster's engine roaring louder than anything else at the fairground that day, she had felt the crowd's energy pivot in a way she recognized instantly from every boardroom she had ever stood in. From delight to suspicion to something colder, 100 phone cameras still recording, and beneath the noise, a small, sharp, ugly instinct rising in her own chest that she would later be deeply ashamed of. She had accused him of cheating, not gently. She had said it loudly enough for the nearest 3 rows to hear, that there was no possible way the car's original fuel system had anything so simple as a hidden manual valve, that Sterling engineers had built this car and knew every inch of it, and that whatever this man had done, he had done it before he ever asked to look under the hood. Cole had not argued. He had simply stepped back from the driver's door, let the engine idle, and said, quietly enough that only Ava and the small ring of people nearest the rope could hear it, that the valve was original to the design, installed for exactly this failure mode, and that if she doubted him, she was welcome to check the schematics filed with the original 2014 production run. It was an older man in the crowd, silver-haired and leaning on a cane, who spoke up next, a man nobody had noticed because nobody at Sterling Performance Motors had thought to invite him except as a courtesy, since he had officially retired from the company 9 years earlier. His name was Walter Higgs, and he had been the lead design consultant on the original Dragster platform, the man whose signature was on the very schematics Cole had just referenced, and he told Ava, in front of the cameras that had never stopped recording, that the young man standing by the car was completely correct, that the valve had been his own design element carried forward from an earlier proposal, and that in 9 years of retirement dinners and reunion emails, he had never once heard anyone else in the company mention it, because as far as he knew, only one other engineer besides himself had ever fully understood that system. Walter looked at Cole for a long moment then, something shifting behind his eyes, a recognition trying to surface through 9 years of forgetting, and he asked Cole's name. Cole told him. Walter went very still and said quietly that he remembered that name, that he remembered a memo about housing tolerances that had circulated briefly before an accident nobody at the company liked to discuss, and that he had always wondered, in a vague and uncomfortable way he had never pursued, what had happened to the young engineer who wrote it. Ava did not sleep well that night, and if you are the kind of person who has ever lain awake, running someone else's humiliated face on a loop through your mind, you already understand exactly the shape of what she was feeling, and we would love for you to tell us, in the comments, about a time a moment like that one kept you up long after everyone else had gone home. She pulled the company's old accident files the following morning, the ones from 3 years earlier, expecting routine documentation and finding instead a folder oddly thin for an incident that had cost the company millions, a folder that referenced a prior internal advisory, without including any copy of it. She asked her assistant, a sharp, quietly observant young woman named Priya Nair, who had joined the company only a year earlier and had no particular loyalty to anyone's old reputation, to track down the original memo referenced in the file. It took Priya 4 days of digging through archive servers and old email backups to find it, buried under a folder name that had nothing to do with its contents. A memo dated 11 months before the accident, written and signed by a design engineer named Cole Bennett, flagging the exact failure mode that had nearly ended someone's career on live television 3 years later, and a follow-up chain showing that Marcus Reyes had received it, read it, and never escalated it. Ava sat with that memo for a long time before she did anything else. She thought about the maintenance technician, who had reached behind a driver's seat, like he'd done it 1,000 times, who had not gloated, who had not argued when she'd accused him of cheating, who had simply stated the facts once and stepped back. She thought about her father, who had built this company on the idea that the people who actually understood the machines mattered more than the people who merely managed them, an idea Ava was no longer certain the company still practiced. And she thought about Marcus Reyes, still vice president of product integrity, still fluent and confident in every meeting, still, as of that very week, leading the technical review board for Sterling's newest contract, a 3-year, $42 million partnership with the same national racing circuit, whose sponsorship deal had been on the line the day the original accident happened. The contract was due to be finalized in 5 weeks. If the story of a buried safety memo became public before then, the racing circuit's legal team would have every right to walk away from the table entirely, and Ava's board, already nervous after 2 rocky fiscal quarters, would very likely blame her personally for reopening a 3-year-old wound at the worst possible moment. She drove to the address Priya had found for Cole Bennett on a Saturday afternoon 3 weeks after the charity event, unannounced, telling no one at the company where she was going. She found the yellow house with the garage door that never closed quite right, and through the gap she could see Cole bent over an engine block with his daughter beside him on an overturned paint bucket, handing him a wrench before he asked for it. Both of them absorbed in something that looked, from the outside, like the quietest kind of peace Ava had witnessed in longer than she could remember. She almost turned around. She did not, and when Cole straightened and saw her standing at the end of his driveway, he did not look surprised, only tired in a way that had nothing to do with the hour of the day. She offered him everything she thought a man in his position might want. A settlement, generous and immediate. A senior engineering position, restored with back pay. A public apology, issued on the company's own terms and timeline. Cole listened to all of it, without interrupting, Sophie's small hand finding his sleeve partway through. And when Ava finished, S said that he did not want a settlement, and he did not particularly want his old title back, because the man who had held that title 9 years ago did not entirely exist anymore, not after everything that had happened since. What he wanted, he said, was for the truth to exist somewhere other than a locked drawer under his workbench, and for no other engineer at Sterling Performance Motors to ever again watch a memo they wrote vanish into a folder marked resolved, with nothing resolved inside it. Ava told him she needed time, 5 weeks at most, to find a way to bring the truth forward without detonating a contract that 400 employees' jobs depended on. Cole said that he understood exactly what it meant to protect people who depended on you, and that he was in no hurry, because he had waited 3 years already and had learned, the hard way, that some truths could survive a little more patience. She left that afternoon without a plan, only a growing, uncomfortable certainty that Marcus Reyes had built his entire post-accident career on top of a hole he had dug for someone else. And 4 days later, that certainty deepened into something closer to alarm when Priya Nair came to her office pale and hesitant, holding a printout of an internal email thread from that same week, showing that Marcus had somehow already learned Cole Bennett's name was circulating again, and had quietly begun reassigning the technical safety review for the $42 million racing contract to a subordinate 3 weeks ahead of schedule, in language that framed it as routine delegation, but that Priya, watching the timestamps, suspected was something closer to Marcus stepping out of the blast radius, before anyone else even knew there was a bomb. 4 weeks would pass, tense and quiet, before the technical review board would convene one final time to approve the racing contract. A meeting neither Ava nor Marcus yet knew would include an uninvited guest. The 4 weeks between Ava's visit to the Yellow House and the final technical review meeting were, for her, the longest stretch of sustained unease she had experienced since taking over the company. Because every path she considered seemed to cost something she was not certain she was willing to pay. She could confront Marcus directly and risk him destroying whatever paper trail Priya had not yet secured. She could bring the memo to the board immediately and risk the racing circuit's lawyers using it as leverage to renegotiate the entire $42 million contract downward at the worst possible moment. Or she could do nothing, let the contract close, let Marcus keep his title, and let Cole Bennett go back to his garage with a sincere private apology and a check large enough to ease his conscience, which was, if she was honest with herself in the quiet of her own office at 11 at night, the option that would cost her personally the least. She hated how long she let herself consider it. What changed her mind in the end was not a grand realization, but a smaller, sharper one. Continuing to quietly gather documentation, found a second memo, this one more recent, showing that Marcus had known about a stress fatigue issue in the current racing contract's prototype engine mounts for 6 weeks, and had not yet escalated it to the board, choosing instead to schedule additional internal testing that conveniently would not conclude until after the contract's signing date. It was the same pattern, exactly, down to the language, a problem identified, quietly buried, time to surface only after the money had already changed hands. Ava realized, sitting with that second memo at midnight, that this was never a single mistake that had happened to Cole Bennett 9 years ago. It was how Marcus Reyes had always operated, and it would keep happening to someone else, indefinitely, unless it was stopped in a way that could not be quietly buried again. She called Cole the following morning and asked him a single question. If she brought him into the final technical review meeting, not as a wronged former employee seeking justice, but simply as a design consultant asked to evaluate an engine mount fatigue issue on its technical merits, would he come? Cole was quiet on the phone for a long moment, and Sophie's voice could be heard faintly in the background asking who was calling. And when he answered, he said that he would come on one condition, that whatever happened in that room, he would not raise his voice, would not accuse anyone of anything, and would simply show his work, the same way he always had, and let the numbers speak for themselves. Ava said that was exactly what she was hoping for. The review meeting took place on a Thursday morning in the same class conference room, where Cole had once been terminated 9 years earlier, a detail Ava had not thought to consider until Cole walked in and paused at the threshold for half a second, a pause so brief that only Ava, watching closely, noticed it at all. Marcus was already seated at the head of the table, flanked by 2 junior engineers and a compliance officer, running through a slide deck that described the engine mount testing as on track, no anomalies of concern, language so smooth and so confident that Ava understood, in that moment, exactly how he had gotten away with it the first time. She introduced Cole simply as an outside technical consultant brought in to review the fatigue data and watched Marcus's easy expression falter for just a fraction of a second, a flicker so small most people in the room would have missed it entirely. Cole did not raise his voice. He asked politely to see the raw stress test logs rather than the summarized slide, and when the compliance officer pulled them up, Cole walked the room through them with the same quiet precision Sophie had watched him use on 100 Saturday mornings in their garage, pointing to a specific data cluster at the 41,000 cycle mark where the fatigue readings had begun climbing outside acceptable tolerance, a cluster that had been smoothed over in the summary slide with an averaged figure that made the trend invisible unless you knew exactly where to look. He named the specific alloy composition of the engine mount housing, cross-referenced it against a materials bulletin from 11 years earlier that he happened to remember because he had helped write it, and explained, in plain and unhurried language, that the housing modification made 6 weeks ago to save manufacturing costs had reintroduced almost exactly the same vulnerability that had caused the original accident 3 years prior, in a different component but through an identical failure logic. A corner cut quietly under schedule pressure, its risk buried in an average instead of flagged in a specific number. The room went very still. One of the junior engineers, a woman who had joined the company only 8 months earlier and clearly had no history with any of this, asked, with the kind of innocent directness that only someone new can manage, how Marcus's team had missed a pattern this specific if the underlying data had been sitting right there in the raw logs the whole time. Marcus said, smoothly at first, that raw data always contained noise, that experienced teams knew how to read past statistical anomalies, that this was precisely why senior oversight existed. But Cole, without raising his voice, without a trace of triumph in it, said only that he had flagged this exact failure logic once before, 9 years ago, in a memo dated 11 months before the accident that nearly ended someone that day at their fairground, and before that very nearly ended several people on a live television broadcast, and that the memo had disappeared from the file before anyone in leadership ever saw it. Marcus's composure did not shatter all at once. It came apart the way these things always do, in small cracks, a slight change in the color of his face, a beat too long before his next sentence, an attempt to pivot toward procedural technicalities about who had signed off on which testing phase that fooled no one in the room, including the compliance officer, who was already quietly pulling up the same email thread Priya had found weeks earlier. When Ava asked him, directly and without theatrics, whether he recalled receiving a memo from Cole Bennett 11 months before the original accident, Marcus's answer, a clipped and unconvincing claim that he had no specific recollection of it, landed in the room like something breaking, because everyone present could see, in the sudden stiffness of his posture, that this was not the answer of a man telling the truth. Cole did not press further. He had said what needed saying, and he sat back in his chair with the same stillness he had carried into the room, watching the numbers finish the work he had started, and Ava understood, watching him, that this restraint was not weakness, that a man who could have used this moment to humiliate the person who destroyed his career instead chose only to lay out the facts and let them stand on their own. There is something in that choice worth sitting with, something that touches an old and familiar tension many of us carry. Whether real strength looks like the loud, public reckoning we sometimes crave on someone else's behalf, or whether it looks instead like a quiet man simply telling the truth once, clearly, and trusting it to be enough. And we suspect quite a few of you watching have strong feelings about which kind of strength you'd choose in his position. So we'd love to hear your take in the comments below. The board suspended the contract signing that same afternoon, pending an independent audit of both the current engine mount data and the 9-year-old accident file, and Marcus Reyes was placed on administrative leave before the end of the week, a fall that would, over the following month, prove far steeper and more final than anyone in that glass conference room yet anticipated. Ava walked Cole out of the building that afternoon, past the same glass doors he had once carried a cardboard box through 9 years earlier, and she told him, quietly, that whatever came next, she intended to make sure his name was attached publicly to work that had always belonged to him. Cole only nodded, and asked whether Sophie could come by the office sometime to see where engines like the one in the garage actually got built. And Ava, surprised by her own reaction, found that she was blinking back something unexpected at the simplicity of the request. 1 month would pass, filled with an internal audit, a quietly negotiated resolution with the racing circuit, and a growing, unspoken understanding between a CEO and a mechanic that neither of them had yet said out loud, before Sterling Performance Motors would hold a small event that would finally put things right, in front of the very people who had once watched Cole Bennett be laughed at over a $500 joke. The event Sterling Performance Motors held 1 month later was not the kind of spectacle the company's marketing department had wanted, though several of them had pushed hard for exactly that, a press conference with cameras and a stage and a scripted apology that would generate the maximum possible coverage. Ava overruled them. She chose instead to hold a smaller gathering, back at the same fairground where the original charity event had taken place, inviting many of the same people who had stood at that rope line a month and a half earlier, along with Walter Higgs, the retired designer who had first spoken up in Cole's defense, and a handful of local journalists who had covered the original viral moment when it first began circulating online. The dragster sat in the same spot it had before, freshly restored now at the company's expense, its engine gleaming, and beside it stood a small plaque that had not existed a month and a half ago, engraved simply with the words, "Safety Valve System, designed by Cole Bennett and 14, restored to public record 2026. Ava stood in front of that small crowd and did not give the polished, deflecting kind of statement her legal team had drafted for her. She told them plainly that 9 years earlier, an engineer named Cole Bennett had identified a critical safety flaw in this very car 11 months before it became public in the worst possible way, that his warning had been buried by someone since removed from the company, and that Cole had paid for another man's failure with his career, his reputation, and 9 years of silence, while raising a daughter alone through the hardest years of his life. She said that the company had spent those 9 years quietly using his design without his name attached to it, and that this ended today. She did not ask the crowd to forgive the company. She simply told them the truth, in front of the maximum number of witnesses she could gather, and let it stand. Then she turned to Cole, who stood off to the side in the same faded flannel he seemed to prefer to anything more formal, Sophie's hand in his, and she offered him, in front of everyone, the position of Chief Design Officer for Sterling Performance Motors, full authority over engineering safety review, more compensation than he had ever earned in his life, and a permanent public correction to every internal record bearing his name. Cole listened, the crowd hushed around him, cameras raised, and when he answered, his voice was as quiet as it had always been, carrying easily anyway in the stillness. He said he did not want the title, not because he doubted his own ability to hold it, but because a title like that would put him back behind a desk and away from the work he had actually come to love again, work with his hands, work he now did with his daughter on Saturday mornings. What he asked for instead was smaller and in its own way larger, a permanent, protected internal channel where any engineer at any level could file a safety concern that could never be quietly reassigned, buried or erased by a supervisor, reviewed instead by an independent board with the authority to escalate directly to the CEO's office, no exceptions, no folders marked resolved with nothing resolved inside them. Ava agreed on the spot, and the crowd, sensing something rare in what they had just witnessed, a man declining wealth and title in favor of protecting strangers he would never meet, applauded in a way that had nothing performative in it at all. There is an old tension in stories like this one worth naming honestly. Some believe that once the truth comes out, the person wronged deserves every material reward available, the title, the money, the corner office, as full compensation for years taken from them, while others believe that real vindication was never about the title at all, that a man like Cole had already built something worth more than any office in the years he spent quietly rebuilding engines and raising his daughter, and that what he wanted at the end only confirmed it. We suspect this story will land differently depending on which of those instincts feels truer to you, and that is exactly as it should be. 3 months later, on an ordinary Saturday afternoon that looked, from the outside, almost exactly like every other Saturday afternoon in the small yellow house with the garage door that still did not close quite right, Cole Bennett knelt beside an engine block with his daughter on her usual overturned bucket, handing him a 9/16 wrench before he asked for it. And Ava Sterling stood in the doorway of that same garage, invited this time, holding 2 cups of coffee, one of which she handed to Cole without being asked, because she had learned, over 3 months of occasional visits, exactly how he took it. She had come ostensibly to drop off the first formal charter for the new safety review board, already signed and already being used, twice, by engineers who might otherwise have stayed silent. But she stayed longer than the errand required, watching Cole and Sophie work in the unhurried rhythm they had built together. Over years, neither of them had ever needed anyone else to witness. And when Sophie asked, without looking up from the wrench in her hand, whether Ava had ever built an engine herself, Ava admitted that she had not with her own hands, not once in her entire life running a company built on exactly that kind of work. Cole told her quietly that it was never too late to learn, and handed her a rag to wipe her hands with before she even realized they had gotten dirty. If there is one thing this story asks you to carry away with you, let it be this. The quietest people in any room are so rarely the least capable ones, and the value someone carries has almost nothing to do with how loudly they announce it, and almost everything to do with what they choose to do when nobody else is watching, the way Cole chose, for 9 long years, to keep showing up for his daughter instead of fighting a battle that might have cost them both everything, and the way, in the end, the truth found its own way to the surface anyway, because that is what truth tends to do. Given enough patience and the right person willing to reach behind the seat that everyone else was too certain to check. Has someone in your own life ever been the quiet one everyone underestimated? The person who turned out to know more, to carry more, to be worth more than anyone around them ever bothered to notice until it was almost too late. We would love for you to tell us about them in the comments below, even if it is only to finally say, in public, the thing you always wished someone had said sooner. And if you believe, the way we do, that quiet, overlooked people deserve to be seen for exactly who they are, we would be glad to have you stay part of this story with us. Subscribing not because anyone asked you to, but because you believe these stories are worth telling. Stay with us, because the final truth of who Cole Bennett really was, and what he built long before anyone was watching, is only just beginning.